There's a claim that gets repeated at Thanksgiving tables across the United States, more often than almost any other family story. Someone leans back, mentions an ancestor, and says it with total confidence, "We came over on the Mayflower." Tens of millions of Americans believe some version of this about their own family. Genealogical societies, built entirely around proving it, have existed for well over a century, and membership in them confers a kind of quiet social status, a claim to being original, to being first, and to having roots that reach back to the actual founding moment of the country, and for most of American history, nobody ever really checked. The stories were passed down, written into family Bibles, printed in privately published genealogies, and accepted at face value because who was going to argue with your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother? But something has changed in the last 2 decades. DNA testing became cheap, widely available, and statistically powerful enough to do something family lore was never built to survive: get checked against the actual biological record. And when genetic genealogists started running that check against Mayflower ancestry claims specifically, what came back was not a simple yes or a simple no. It was something far stranger and far more revealing about how American identity actually works. Let's start with what actually happened in 1620, because the reality was smaller, harder, and far more fragile than the myth that grew up around it. A single ship, roughly 100 feet long, carried 102 passengers across the Atlantic in a crossing that took over 2 months through brutal autumn seas. They were not a uniform group of religious idealists. Some were separatists fleeing religious persecution, the ones history remembers as pilgrims, but many others were tradesmen, servants, and opportunists who signed on for entirely secular reasons. They landed not in the middle of a fertile paradise, but on the edge of a New England winter, with no shelter built, no crops planted, and no idea what they were doing. Of the 102 people who arrived, roughly half died before the following spring, wiped out by cold, disease, and starvation. Entire families were erased in a matter of weeks. What survived was a core of maybe 50 people, and it is from that surviving core, not the full passenger list, that essentially every documented Mayflower descendant in America today has to trace their line. That is the first thing the myth compresses out of existence. The founding population was not just small. It was catastrophically thinned within months of arrival, which means the genetic and genealogical bottleneck at the very root of this story is far tighter than most people claiming descent have ever stopped to consider. Now overlay the paperwork problem onto that biological bottleneck, because this is where the story starts to get genuinely complicated. For roughly 2.5 centuries after 1620, there was no formal standardized system for proving descent from a Mayflower passenger. Family claims were passed down informally, recorded in personal Bibles, repeated in obituaries, and eventually compiled by amateur genealogists in the 1800s. In many cases, those genealogists were working from incomplete records, faulty assumptions, and in some documented instances, outright fabrication. The organization that exists today, specifically to formalize and verify these claims, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, was not founded until 1897, nearly 280 years after the ship landed. Its entire purpose was to impose rigor on a genealogical landscape that had, by that point, already accumulated more than 2 centuries of unverified assumptions. The society built what genealogists call the silver books, meticulously documented, generation by generation paper trails, connecting a living applicant back to a specific Mayflower passenger through an unbroken chain of birth records, marriage records, wills, and church registers. It sounds airtight. In many cases, it genuinely is airtight as a paper record. But here is the quiet assumption buried inside every single one of those paper trails, an assumption that no birth certificate, no church register, and no probate record can ever actually verify. Every single link in that chain assumes that the recorded father was, in fact, the biological father. And that assumption, repeated across roughly 13 or 14 generations of American family history, is exactly the kind of assumption that DNA testing was eventually going to be able to check. This is where the genetic genealogists enter the picture, and where the story stops being about paperwork and starts being about biology. When Y-DNA testing became affordable and widely accessible through direct-to-consumer companies in the 2000s and 2010s, genealogists realized they had a tool that could do something remarkable. Y-DNA passes from father to son, largely unchanged for many generations, meaning that if 2 men today both have documented paper trails claiming descent from the same Mayflower passenger through an unbroken male line, their Y-DNA should match. If it does not match, something happened somewhere in that chain that the paper record never captured. Genetic genealogy researchers organized surname projects around exactly this question, pulling in men who all claimed descent from the same Mayflower-era patriarch and comparing their Y-DNA results directly against each other. And what emerged from those projects was neither full vindication nor full debunking. It was something messier and more interesting. In several well-documented surname lines, the majority of tested male descendants did match each other, producing a consistent genetic signature that lined up with the paper genealogy and effectively confirmed at the biological level that the documented chain of fathers and sons was accurate all the way back. But in other lines, the results split. A cluster of men would share one Y DNA signature, while another cluster, claiming descent from the exact same documented ancestor, carried a completely different, unrelated signature. Both groups had paperwork. Both groups had birth certificates and church records tracing an unbroken line. But biologically, they could not both be right. Somewhere in one branch of that family tree, at some point across 4 centuries, a recorded father was not the biological father. And nobody alive at the time ever knew or ever wrote it down because there was no way to know. This is the part of the story that most people never hear, because it complicates a narrative that a lot of people have an emotional investment in keeping simple. Genealogists have a term for this exact phenomenon, a non-paternity event, meaning any instance where the biological father of a child differs from the recorded or assumed father. That could happen through infidelity, adoption, a remarriage, where a stepfather's name was recorded as biological, or simply a clerical error compounding forward through decades of hand-copied records. Individually, in any single generation, the odds of a non-paternity event are relatively low. But genealogy does not operate across a single generation. It operates across 13, 14, sometimes 15 generations between 1620 and today. And small probabilities, compounded across that many links in a chain, stop being small. Even a modest per-generation rate of misattributed paternity, applied repeatedly across 4 centuries, means that a meaningful percentage of documented Mayflower lineages are statistically likely to contain at least one broken biological link somewhere in the chain. That can remain true even when every single piece of paper in that chain is completely genuine and was recorded in good faith. Nobody lied. Nobody forged a document. The paper trail can be 100% authentic and still not reflect the actual biological descent, because the people writing those records 400 years ago had no way of knowing what modern genetics can now reveal. What makes this even more fascinating is what happens when you flip the question around and ask not which documented lines hold up, but which unverified family myths have been circulating for generations without any legitimate paper trail at all. Alongside the formally documented Mayflower Society lineages sits an enormous, sprawling ocean of informal family claims, the ones repeated at holiday dinners and printed in 19th century vanity genealogies sold door to door. 2 families eager to buy a connection to a prestigious ancestor. Genealogical researchers have spent decades identifying and cataloging specific fabricated or unsupported lineage claims that spread widely through these privately printed family histories. Those claims get copied uncritically from book to book and eventually from website to website until they take on the appearance of established fact simply through repetition. Entire family trees exist today, shared and reshared across online genealogy platforms that connect ordinary American families to Mayflower passengers through links that were never actually documented. Links that some enterprising genealogist in 1850 or 1920 simply asserted, perhaps in good faith, perhaps to flatter a paying client, and which then propagated forward for a century before anyone thought to check them against an actual church register, let alone a DNA test. When genetic genealogists eventually did check some of these popular but undocumented claims, a striking number of them collapsed entirely. The Y DNA or the autosomal segments simply were not there. The myth had outlived its own evidence for so long that nobody remembered it had never been proven in the first place. And then there is the opposite problem. The lines that cannot be checked at all, not because the paperwork is bad, but because the biology itself made verification impossible. Y-DNA testing only works for tracing an unbroken male line, meaning it can only confirm descent from a male Mayflower passenger through his sons' sons, and so on. But roughly half of any given ancestor's descendants are women, and the moment a line passes through a daughter, the Y-DNA thread breaks permanently. This means that for many of the most famous women who sailed on the Mayflower, women whose stories are told constantly in American cultural memory, there is no genetic tool available that can definitively confirm a modern descendant's line all the way back through an unbroken chain, because the male line marker required for that kind of test was never carried by a woman to begin with. Mitochondrial DNA offers a partial substitute, since it passes from mother to child largely unchanged, but it only traces the strict maternal line, mother to mother to mother, which is an even narrower and more fragile thread than the male line. That thread has often gone extinct or become impossible to trace within just a handful of generations. The result is an uncomfortable asymmetry sitting at the very heart of the Mayflower descent industry. Some lines, mostly the ones passing through well-documented male surnames, have been genetically checkable, and in a meaningful number of cases, genetically confirmed. Other lines, including some of the most celebrated names in the entire Mayflower story, simply cannot be verified at all with current technology, not because the biology says no, but because the biology left no thread behind to pull. What all of this reveals, when you step back from the individual surname projects and look at the whole picture, is not really a story about genetics at all. It is a story about how thin the line has always been between documented history and inherited myth, and how much emotional and social weight Americans have placed on a claim that turns out to be, at the biological level, far more uncertain and far more fragile than the confident dinner table version ever admits. Membership in the Mayflower Society is not just a hobby. For over a century, it has functioned as a marker of a particular kind of American belonging, an implicit claim to being here first, to being foundational rather than immigrant, and to having a bloodline that predates the country itself by more than a century and a half. Colonial heritage societies of every kind, not just this one, have used exactly this kind of ancestral claim to construct a hierarchy of American authenticity, one where documented descent from an early colonial arrival confers a status that no amount of later achievement can fully replicate. And that is precisely why the DNA findings matter so much to the people involved, and precisely why so many of them would rather not look too closely. A genetic result that quietly breaks a 4-century paper chain does not just correct a historical record. It threatens an identity that families have built and defended, sometimes for generations, often without any awareness that the chain was ever genetically uncertain in the first place. There's another layer to this that the Y-DNA surname projects, as revealing as they are, only partially capture. And that layer opened up once autosomal DNA testing went mainstream through consumer platforms in the 2010s. Unlike Y-DNA, which only follows a single unbroken male thread, autosomal testing looks at DNA inherited from both parents, blended and reshuffled every generation, which means it can theoretically detect a genetic connection to an ancestor through any branch of a family tree, not just the strict father-to-son line. In practice, this cuts both ways, and both directions turn out to be instructive. On one hand, autosomal DNA degrades in detectability fairly quickly across generations, since each generation only inherits roughly half of a parent's genetic material. By the time you get 10 or 12 generations removed from a single 1620 ancestor, the actual measurable genetic contribution from that one individual has often been diluted down to a vanishingly small, sometimes statistically undetectable fraction, even in cases where the paper genealogy is completely accurate. This alone is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means that even a perfectly documented, perfectly biological line of descent from a Mayflower passenger may leave almost no detectable trace in a modern descendant's raw autosomal DNA results, simply due to the ordinary mathematics of inheritance dilution over 4 centuries. On the other hand, when large numbers of people who all claim descent from the same Mayflower ancestor upload their raw data to genetic genealogy matching platforms, researchers can look for shared DNA segments, clustering across many unrelated testers who share no other documented connection except that one distant ancestor. When that kind of clustering shows up consistently across dozens or hundreds of independent testers, it becomes a different, and in some ways more convincing, form of evidence than any single Y-DNA match, because it does not depend on an unbroken male line surviving intact. Several of the most heavily documented Mayflower families have, in fact, produced exactly this kind of clustering evidence, with genetic genealogists identifying shared segments among large groups of people whose only common ancestor, as far as anyone can determine, traces back to the same 1620 arrival. It is not proof in the courtroom sense. It is closer to what researchers call a preponderance of evidence, the kind of finding that will never fully satisfy a skeptic demanding absolute certainty, but that gives the paper genealogy a genuine biological backbone it did not have a generation ago. Consider what this looks like in practice, using one of the more heavily researched examples without getting lost in any single family's specific paperwork. Descendants of certain well-documented Mayflower passengers, men whose sons and grandsons stayed in New England, kept detailed church and probate records, and were repeatedly documented across multiple independent town histories, have produced some of the clearest Y-DNA matches in the entire genetic genealogy record for early colonial America. Men today from Ohio, from Texas, from Oregon, with no knowledge of each other and no shared family contact for centuries, submit DNA samples to a testing company and discover they carry a nearly identical Y chromosome signature. That signature traces, through independently compiled paper genealogies on each side, back to the same individual documented in Plymouth colony records from the 1620s and 1630s. When that happens, and it has happened repeatedly across several of the more thoroughly documented Mayflower surnames, it represents something genuinely rare in genealogical research. It is a case where oral tradition, handwritten colonial records, 19th century compiled genealogies, and 21st century molecular biology all independently arrive at the same conclusion. That convergence is what makes the confirmed cases so compelling, and it is exactly why the broken cases, the ones where the DNA quietly contradicts 200 years of confident family storytelling, land with such force when they surface. There is also a deeper irony sitting underneath the entire Mayflower origin story, one that the genetic research inevitably runs into whether it intends to or not. Every single conversation about who has the most authentic, most original claim to American ancestry through a 1620 arrival is a conversation that entirely brackets out the population already living on that land for thousands of years before the ship ever appeared on the horizon. The genetic story of the Mayflower is a story about a tiny founding population of European colonists and how thinly and unevenly their descent has actually propagated through documented and undocumented lines over 4 centuries. It is not, and was never going to be, a story about who was actually first. That distinction rarely comes up in Mayflower Society newsletters, and it rarely comes up in casual claims at the dinner table either. But it sits quietly underneath the entire premise of using a 1620 arrival as the benchmark for American ancestral authenticity in the first place. So where does that leave the tens of millions of Americans who believe with total sincerity that they descend from a Mayflower passenger? The honest answer is that some of them are almost certainly right, and the DNA has, in specific documented surname lines, actually confirmed it. It has matched living men today to a genetic signature that traces cleanly back through a paper record that turns out to reflect real, unbroken biological descent across 400 years. Others are almost certainly wrong, carrying a family story that was asserted once, decades, or centuries ago and never verified. The story was repeated so many times that it eventually calcified into apparent fact. And a significant number of people occupy a genuinely unknowable middle ground, descended perhaps from a woman who sailed on that ship through a line that no current genetic technology can confirm or deny. They are left holding a story that is neither provably true nor provably false, just permanently, structurally uncertain. What the science actually offers is not a verdict on any individual family's pride. It is a much stranger and more honest observation about memory itself, about how a chain of ordinary human choices can silently determine whether a story told with complete confidence for 200 years turns out to be biologically real or not. A birth here, a remarriage there, a name recorded by a tired county clerk 4 generations back, each one can alter the chain without anyone realizing it. And almost nobody in that long chain of storytellers ever had any way of knowing which kind of story they were passing down. The ship is real. The winter that killed half its passengers is real. The paper trails, for the most part, were compiled honestly. But underneath every single one of them runs the same quiet, 400-year-old question the DNA can only partially answer. Whose blood is this, really? And how far back can any of us actually prove it? Belongs to the people we have always assumed it did.